colleagues, dear friends, good afternoon or good evening already, everyone. My name is Andris Strūts. I'm director of Latvian Institute of International Affairs. I'm also professor at Riga Dialogue University. Today I have a great pleasure to welcome all of you to the panel discussion on challenged and changing political leadership in West-Russia relations. I see there is a full house, so it seems that everyone is willing to be present. So I welcome everyone here in the house, but at the same time, of course, I welcome everyone who watches us online. This panel discussion is part of the wider Riga Dialogue process. So we had a very fruitful, very lively, interesting debates today for the whole day. It's the process of Riga Dialogue, which we have established together with our partner institutions. It's a European Leadership Network, Nuclear Threat Initiative, the Russian International Affairs Council, and Friedrich-Ebert Stiftung. So we are also very grateful to our partners because events, the processes, the dialogue absolutely should include partners, and I think this is a multi-partner endeavor among us. And we are also very happy to bring this debate on challenging, changing political leadership in Western Russian relations also to the public, to have also your feedback, your reactions, your questions, because I think it's important also to engage. The pandemic is a primary game in town and dominates our daily agenda for now. But at the same time, geopolitics has never gone and actually directly influences how we deal with the pandemic globally and also, of course, nationally. So the global politics clearly influences domestic politics and also regional dynamics. If we take some examples, troop withdrawal and submarine deals, some are far away, but shape our national perceptions and expectations of solidarity and mutual trust. Weaponized migration tests our societal resilience. Energy interdependence and importance of global approach to climate actually raises questions how converging interests could be accommodated with diverging value systems. So it means that those global developments certainly have a lot of impact footprint on our mental maps, also on our actions, how we act domestically, and how, of course, through domestic action we act regionally. So this last point indicates that global politics basically also starts at home. So on the one hand, we may say that international developments, dynamics influence domestic politics, but domestic developments become building bricks in the global architecture. And national leadership and its choices are very instrumental. And if we look in a wider Euro-Atlantic and Eurasian community, and by Euro-Atlantic we mean transatlantic and also European, which includes our partners and neighbors in more on the east from Latvia. So there are, of course, very diverging styles. If to paraphrase the long-standing Prime Minister of Luxembourg, who was also then the head of European Commission, to paraphrase, politicians know what to do but don't know how to be re-elected. Perhaps in some countries, politicians know very well how to be re-elected, but actually may have some challenges how to engage through society. So there are different political leadership styles. So, and with these domestic developments, with also the leadership factor within domestic dynamics, we come to the Western Russian relations and how those two things, in a way, may correlate. And we have excellent and diverse panel of speakers. Margarita Sheshelgite, Director of the Institute of International Relations and Political Science from Vilnius University. Margarita, very welcome to join us.
Thank you, Andres.
We have Christoph Maci, who is a member of German Bundestag and also one of the active members of Social Democrats. Congratulations. Social Democrats on foreign policy and also educational policy as a social also policies. Active member. Interesting, Christoph, if I immediately may add, it's interesting that you started as a theologist. So that's the global perspective. I think it gives additional angle to look at the global and also domestic development. So thank you for joining us. We have James Sher, who is a senior fellow now at the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute, and of course has been also associated for a long time with the Chatham House in London. So, and of course, James, of course, is old friend and old partner of the Institute and mine. So happy to have you, James, also here, and we look for thought-provoking remarks and insights. Last but not least, Victoria Panova, because we are happy to engage also with our Russian partners, this time online. Still, there is some incompatibility with vaccinations. So European vaccination and Russian vaccinations are a little bit diverging in their legitimacy, if you may say so. But Victoria, we are happy to have you on board. So you are, of course, Vice President for International Relations of Far Eastern Federal University in Vladivostok. By the way, you are in Vladivostok now in the midnight, or you are in Moscow? We cannot hear you.
I'm now in Moscow. Can you hear me?
Okay, Vika, we'll come back to you, so we will explain also your location. So we are happy to have you on board. And let's start, Margarita, let's start with you to provide a little bit wider perspective on leadership, perhaps also touching upon European developments, to sort of start the more conceptual frame for the rest of discussion. Please, Margarita, the floor is yours. And I'm very kind to ask, please, 5, maximum 7 minutes to have your introductory remarks so we can engage also the audience. Margarita, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andres, first of all, for inviting me, and it's great to be here. It's not the first time that I'm here and speaking for this distinguished publics, but it's the first time that the topic really makes me nervous, because to talk about the leadership in West-Russia relations, it's not an easy task. And then there is a title says challenged and changing political leadership in the West-Russia relations. So the leadership in Russia was neither challenged nor changing for a number of years. So we don't expect much changes from that side. So probably then I will speak more about the Western part. But talking about the Western leadership, again, the problem is, the challenge is that we don't have certain single Western leadership. We are facing a number of divergent leaderships in the West on the issue of Russia, but not necessarily on the issue of Russia, which at the end of the day has an impact on Russia. And these different leaderships, they construct the picture, the full picture. Usually what we are having from the West, either it's vis-à-vis Russia or vis-à-vis other regions or countries or subjects, is the lowest common denominator of very different styles of leadership and interests of leaders and demands of the society in particular countries towards these leaderships. So there are a number of books when it comes to defining what is the leadership, what is the political leadership. And in the recent years, we have been discussing what type of leadership is the best leadership. As Andres very rightly have noted, that there are certain leaderships which makes the politicians, allows politicians to be easily elected, but then there are other types of the leaderships which allows politicians to solve the crisis. There are leaders who are idealistic leaders, there are leaders who are pragmatic leaders. Sometimes the leaders are pragmatic leaders, but they are imposed upon the idealistic foreign policies. And that also changes the final outcome. There are leaders who try to live in an authoritarian way, and we had a lot of discussions in the recent years that probably authoritarian or autocratic style of leadership is better in solving the crisis. And the democratic or liberal leadership is lagging behind, because during the crisis we have to have the very clear chain of command, very fast decisions, and the democracies were struggling with that. So there are visionary leaderships which define the certain visions where certain countries or the regions should head to. And one of the examples of this leadership is French President Emmanuel Macron, who is having grand visions. But there are also different types of leaderships, very technocratic and mobilizing leaderships, what could be attributed to the still German Chancellor Angela Merkel. And in different times of history and for different areas, different kind of leaderships are needed. There was this survey, pan-European level survey conducted by European Council on Foreign Relations. If they would have to elect the president for Europe between Merkel and Macron, so what they would choose. And over 40% have chosen Merkel. And so it's the leadership style which is liked by the societies. But is it the best leadership type for the reforms? And we had a very interesting discussion with my German colleagues that sometimes this trying to be nice and please everyone, to find, you know, the common lowest denominator, to strike the deal in the very diverse audience, does not make you a reformist, does not make you a visionary leader, and you're lagging behind in making reforms. So what are we facing at the moment? We're facing several changes. So Merkel is probably going away sometime in January or the end of December, and we will be facing new type of leadership. The legacy of Merkel leadership is very important because she was doing the right things at the right time when the European Union was in crisis, and there was a need for mobilization of different points of view and ability to sit together and come up with a solution. And she did it very well. Will the next chancellor be able to do the same? We don't know what's going to happen with the elections in France. So will we still be having visionary Emmanuel Macron? And what's going to be his style of leadership in Europe? Strategic autonomy, strategic sovereignty, pushing more towards the European integration, looking further away from the US? That could just pave entirely different strategic environment in which we will be operating. Other challenges. If we look at the situation today, we still need mobilization in the European Union. We still need visions for the European Union, but situation is changing. There are things like climate change, the increased rivalry between the big powers, China, Russia, development of the cyber area, development of the artificial intelligence, and these things will require, again, entirely different leadership, probably more assertive, probably more visionary, and will Europeans be able to find this type of the leadership, or will European societies be able to elect people who would impose on Europe such kind of leaderships? So there are a lot of unknowns, and I didn't say a word about Russia, but I think that it's when I'm talking about the leadership styles in the West and leadership capacities and qualities in the West, it's usually not about Russia. Russia is only one piece of the whole picture. So it's not going to be any particular kind of leadership which will be more beneficial or less beneficial for Russia. But what is important that on one hand, there will be more confrontation, and then there will be more need for assertive leadership from the European Union side vis-à-vis Russia, but on the other hand, there will be a number of issues that would require the common solutions. Like we heard today in our discussions, climate change is one of the issues that these solutions have to appear. So it's going to be, again, the need for this very multiple picture with a number of different leaderships in European Union, idealistic, pragmatic, assertive, but also prone for the dialogue and mobilization. And now I don't think that there will be a lot of changes in that perspective. Yeah, I'm finishing.
Margarita, thank you so much. Excellent, because I think this academic approach, I think it's very important to actually set the frame, to show that, of course, leaders and leadership style can influence how things are being solved and dealt with. But at the same time, of course, as you mentioned, I think very rightly and importantly, is that time, the crisis actually shape and forge what type of leadership also it is and what is required. And taking into account that European affairs are facing increasingly permanent number of crises, it seems that actually it might require a specific style of the leadership. So, but very good. Thank you so much for that, the conceptual frame. And with this, we are very happy to move to Christoph, who is a practitioner in politics, who has been dealing with different kind of styles of leadership in German politics. Christoph, if I'm not mistaken, you are in German Bundestag since 1990. Wow. The last 30 years you've been in German politics, so you've seen everything starting from unification. Yeah. So what about Germany? What about post-Merkel leadership style? How you would define it and how it could influence also the Western-Russian interaction? Please, Christoph, we're happy to have you on the board. Please.
Thank you very much also for the invitation to be here with you. Let me start maybe with the result of the election. We don't know yet what government will come out of this election, but my guess is that we will see a coalition between the Social Democratic Party, the Green Party, and the Liberal Party. I mean, the CDU is still struggling to keep itself in the game, but I don't think they will succeed to form a coalition. So the first question is, if we talk about political leadership, does it change the foreign policy of Germany? I mean, it will be the first time that we have a coalition consisting of 3 different parties. And we have most probably the Greens back in the government. They haven't been in government for 16 years. So the first task for the new government will be to find a common understanding of foreign policy. Looking to the Social Democratic Party and to Olaf Scholz, I mean, there's not so much change comparative with the existing government, with Merkel. But we will see a chancellor who is more focused on the European development. This is, for Olaf Scholz, it is key for foreign policy to further develop European Union, to deepen the cooperation inside the European Union, because our understanding is that German leadership cannot be a national leadership. It can be a leadership only through European Union and its institutions. So if we look to the Green Party, we will have some of the discussions, because in the last years they have focused a lot on a so-called values-based foreign policy instead of an interest-based foreign policy. But I think we need the right balance between it. You don't have only values-based foreign policy or interest-based foreign policy. So what could be the next steps after forming the government? We have 2 important discussions going on. One is the discussion about the EU strategic compass, where for the first time the EU tries to have a common risk assessment. What are the threats and challenges for the European Union? And based on that common risk assessment, a common strategy. So, and it will be very important for the government to step up first with involving in this discussion, because I suppose forming the government will take until December, and then we have only a few months left because the strategic compass, the schedule is to be decided before the French election. So, and the second process is we are in the middle of the discussion of the strategy of NATO, and both of these discussions have to be connected, because we cannot have a parallel discussion with different outcome. It doesn't make sense, because NATO and NATO strategy and the EU strategic compass should be made in a way that we can cooperate in the best way. So I think this is means for political leadership in Germany, that we try not just to put the German interest into this process, but also to be a good mediator with the different European interests, to balance them. And that brings me to another point. What kind of leadership is needed in the coming years? Is it a kind of strongman leadership? Or is it more a leadership of a political person that can balance different interests, manage a complex system? Because the EU is not comparative to EU leadership is not comparative to leadership in the United States or in Russia or in China, because it has to integrate a lot of different interests inside EU. And as we know, foreign policy is very much influenced by domestic policy. And this is already difficult to handle for states like US, but it is much more difficult to handle for a union like the European Union, because we have in the member states, we have different domestic problems, interests that shape foreign policy. So what is important for the leadership, that that uses the European institutions to play a role, needs to be very smart in balancing the different interests. And I think this is necessary also because none of the European member states alone is able to play in the new geopolitical great power competition. This is only possible with the EU and not for the member states, nor France, nor Germany are strong enough to play that role. So, and this is what shapes political leadership for the coming years. And what we have to look also beside the security problems in foreign policy that we know from the past, we have new challenges like the COVID crisis has shown. We have the challenge of climate change. We have the hybrid threats like influencing democratic societies by social media. We have the cyber attacks. So the challenge for leadership is very complex and even more complex inside the European Union.
Christoph, thank you so much. I think thank you for enlightening us on the developments in German political landscape in the context of European political dynamics, because I think this is exactly connection is very important. But very short follow-up question, because we've been discussing very importantly and eloquently the leadership styles and also developments. Western Russia, I think it's also been one of the questions, of course, how the leadership style change, coalition change in Germany influences or not influences German-Russian, Western-Russian relations. Perhaps some few words, we can come back to this, but still a little bit of some insights.
I think this will be a discussion inside the new coalition to be formed, because the Green Party and the Liberal Party, there were much more or they wanted much more to confront Russia. They were, for example, strictly against Nord Stream 2. Mm-hmm. So the new government has to find a balance how to deal with Russia. I mean, Germany has a special relationship with Russia, but we have to be careful not to try to make it a bilateral relationship. We should be careful to keep it on a European level and to integrate a European view in the relationship towards Russia.
Excellent. Thank you so much. James, you are looking at the watch. It's your turn now.
It's not because anyone has spoken too long. It's not because I'm impatient. I just enjoy doing it. In any case, fine. When Joseph Biden was inaugurated as President of the United States at the end of January, there was an almost settled expectation that with regard to Russia, two things would happen. The first was, and this seemed to be confirmed by his very robust speech at the State Department on the 5th of February, that Russia would now finally be approached from a basis of unvarnished realism. And that as a result of that, and as a result also of the expectation that the power of the United States would be utilized in an intelligent way to press American intrinsic advantages, that Russia finally would be obliged to revise the assumptions underpinning its foreign policy. Here we are 8 months later, and neither of these things have happened, and I do not regard it as being in the least surprising. In the first place, the Russian leadership continues to regard what it calls the collective West, by which it means the United States and its allies that are orientated around American power and influence, as a geopolitical and civilizational complex dedicated to diminishing Russia, isolating it, and undermining its system of governance. That perception has not altered one iota. Secondly, that for Russia, the maintenance of preeminence in its borderlands was an entitlement, and Ukraine and Belarus in particular continue to be regarded as extensions of the Russian homeland and as vital, fundamental interests. None of this has changed. And one reason is that over the intervening months, the Russian administration, the Russian leadership, with all of the pressures upon it internally, believes, as much as it did in the past, that all of these basic challenges are manageable and there is no immediate or foreseeable danger coming from the United States or the West as a whole. Secondly, with regard to Russia, there has been very little meaningful evolution of perceptions in Washington about the character of Russian power and the Russian challenge. Within the past few months, President Biden spoke to the intelligence services about Russia's decline. What he said then was virtually a carbon copy of a much longer speech he gave on the same subject. I believe it was an interview, just after the Russo-Georgian War in 2008. Well, since he gave that speech, we have seen the annexation of Crimea, the war in Donbass, the intervention of Russian forces in Syria and the expansion of their involvement, the creation and utilization of Russian so-called private military companies in Venezuela and across Africa, and a great expansion of the Russo-Chinese strategic partnership. And this is all being accomplished by a declining power. Even the economization of Russian power, which is taking place in a counterintuitive way, and it has become more effective. Why is it that we continue to be so burdened by indirect and covert Russian means to influence the West from inside the West, ranging from cyber attack, data, election hacking, support for far-right and far-left political parties? You can multiply all of this. Two simple reasons. A, it's cheap. B, it's not dangerous. It's not going to lead to war. And therefore, nothing Biden has to say to Putin in Geneva or anywhere else is going to alter this. This is a very effective way of undermining and dividing and undermining an opponent. Second, and my last point, there is a strong perception in this administration, I would say a commanding perception, it's becoming an orthodoxy, that Russia must be separated from China, and that this can be done. One thing those who put this argument fail to say is that if it can be done, it can only be done if the United States meets Russia's terms rather than its own. Well, what are Russia's terms? First, the abandonment of Ukraine and Georgia, not simply a declaration or even a written declaration that they will not be brought into NATO, but the dismantling of the entire machinery built up over almost 30 years of integration and cooperation with the Euro-Atlantic system. Secondly, the removal of the enhanced forward presence of NATO forces in the Baltic states, the removal of its infrastructure in the Black Sea region, and serious steps to change the security architecture of NATO and bring Russia to the top table. One has to ask that if an initiative of this kind were undertaken, for how long would it carry on before major damage were done to the entire, not only the NATO system, but to everything we are? A week, 2 months? It is almost impossible to conceive that any US administration, by definition accountable to Congress, could embark very far down such a road. And that's not all, because we would then have to find some kind of way of responding to what would surely be a growing Chinese security threat to Russia in the Far East and in other regions. But this totally fantastic idea now has a great deal of authority, just as decline does, which has become a kind of narcotic. So I think we are back where we have been and not somewhere new. Thanks, Andres.
Thanks, James.
That's it.
Excellent. So it's exactly what we also needed to add the transatlantic dimension and perhaps even more focus and go into the depths on Western-Russian relations. Excellent. But with this, we are also very happy to bring a Russian participant to hear also the voice from Russia. Victoria, Can you hear us? Can we hear you?
Well, I could hear you from the start. I hope you can hear me now as well.
No, absolutely.
Yes.
Perfect. Please. So, from Moscow or from Vladivostok?
I'm in Moscow, so I just flew in yesterday just for your conference.
Excellent.
Joking, but
Excellent.
yesterday about
We
your
take the
history.
joke seriously, so we take Russian jokes seriously here. So please, challenged and changing in any way in Russia, the leadership?
Well, allow me first to start, because I see to the topic you've put, actually, in fact, two dimensions, and I think both of them are very important and interlinked. We could be talking about external and internal leadership, and before that, I think we were more talking about internal leadership, either within EU or specific EU countries, or within the United States or within Russia. And talk about what type of leaders you need, autocratic, democratic, when we are dealing with a crisis, and definitely the world is dealing with a crisis now. I will come back to that a bit later, but I want to stress attention on the second dimension, which I think is no less important. This is external one. And here, when we're talking about the international relations, international system in flux, still continues to be, and the pandemic, in fact, didn't bring any solutions from the point of view that it could have been the factor that brought humanity together, but vice versa, what we saw, it aggravated existing problems and brought geopolitics even more back to stage than before. And the problem of leadership in this regard is that, yes, we do have official international organizations, we do have countries that are contenders for global leadership now, used to be and still kind of United States, and we have the second pole, not Russia. We have China, but none of those either not able from actually different points of view to lead the world in those difficult times. And I think this is extremely important issue, which in fact influences a whole range of problems that the world is facing now, both transatlantic, Asia Pacific, global, regional, local, because there is no authoritative leader in this world which could lead by example, not by trying to, I don't know, invade in Afghanistan, then leave Afghanistan, not trying to offer its own solutions in, in Asia, but leading by how things should be, which would be followed willingly by the other countries. And I think this is even more important than what we have inside the countries, because it does compromise possibility for fair, inclusive, democratic world where which would be striving for win-win solutions, and this is quite important. When we talk about internal political leadership, indeed, as was mentioned by the first speaker, we saw some changes recently in, well, earlier in the United States with different hopes and then disappointments from different sides. We are seeing now changes which we don't know yet what to bring us to in Germany, and but internally, I think this would rather, it might influence some concrete specific issues like what was mentioned, Nord Stream 2, but it is not likely to have an overall change or for the international system as it is, because it is now unrolling by its own rules without internationally recognized and accepted leader. And that is why in such a system, we are in the position when we have all the problems, and we're not talking here only just about the pandemics, not just about climate change, not just about a number of unconventional security threats, in fact, which are seen similarly, but towards the other side from both sides. When we talk about hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, as you know, it's been a big issue recently with the discussions and how to kind of counter that in Russia during this Duma elections, because it's been perceived that there's a huge attack from so-called collective West, as you said, and it's forces by cyber attacks. What we also see is that there are problems that used to be, earlier we had like hard security that was more on the agenda, and where states or international institutions had to come to table and talk about. But what is more serious today is that, first of all, we have the rising role of force. It continues to be their factor. I don't want to repeat Lavrov, who says that we're not, like Russia is not accepting their rules-based order. But which aspect I would like to comment on here is that it is in fact development which comes from the rise of the law of force, except of their rule of law, because it is much more difficult, and we all as historians or political scientists know it is much more difficult to change their rules that are written with the consensus of all interested parties. And sometimes during turbulent times, the parties that are seeing that they are thinking that they are stronger, or they believe that they are losing their place and that they want to retain the status quo, they could be willing to change the law with the rules by using force. And this is problematic. Another thing which I see influencing not just Russia-West relations, but the whole globe, is that we are going not only from hard security to soft security, we are in fact moving to introducing securitization of humanitarian, of people-to-people contacts and humanitarian cooperation. It's interesting that Andres discussed earlier that with the vaccination rules, we were not able to be kind of joining each other face to face. It is in fact, I see it as part of the current problem of geopolitical games, because I can tell you that just a month and a half ago, we easily traveled to Italy, which is also part of Europe, but probably less prone towards geopolitical confrontations. And there were no problems with vaccines from this point of view. And we are also inviting within next 2 weeks, people from Europe, from United States, and from Asia to Women's Eurasian Forum, and they will be coming in person as well. So this is a part of the game that unfortunately spills over to people-to-people context, and this involves both vaccination and health. It involves sports. It involves educational context and cooperation. And I think this is one of the most difficult and dangerous areas, because counter to what we even had during the Cold War of the 20th century, this in fact closes the way towards negotiations in a more informal manner, while we still continue talking and we can be discussing difficult issues without closing it from each other, while we're still, and what I heard over the past probably even 3 years, it's more than pandemic, is that growing role of stereotypes. People often, even within informal discussions, started talking to each other with stereotypes about their opponent. This is, I think, a problem. We need to go beyond that. Before we manage to do that, we're doomed to stay in confrontation, and we're doomed to stay in a very turbulent and unclear world. Thank you. I'll stop here, but be ready to answer questions.
Victoria, thank you so much for also the wider picture how it looks from Russia. I can just add that we would be happy to have you here in Riga. So it's not about geopolitics, it's about Italians. There is just perhaps a difference of national approaches, so not about geopolitics. But anyway, let's not go into the vaccine story. I think still there will be some continuation of it, and I would agree that at some moment I think there would be a good idea things also harmonize regionally or globally, but it's already another discussion. I would like to ask a number of additional questions, but then I realized that I was kindly asking for 5 minutes each, and then somehow already it's 6:30, so it's 1 hour already has passed. So I self-critically take away the privilege of asking questions and open the floor for audience to raise the questions, raise comments, because I think the feedback is important. And let's take the questions or comments in some rounds. And I can see the first row immediately here is raising the hand. Please, starting with Richard. Then Hamid and then Oyars.
Thank you. Is it working?
Yeah, for live streaming.
Okay. So yeah, my name is Richard Skos. I'm the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Parliament of Latvian. Thank you, panelists, for your views on the leadership challenges and changes in Western-Russia relations. And you know, one can say that actually we talk about these issues whenever the big cycle of elections is somewhat over, and we question where we're going to head towards. As Ms. Sezelgite already mentioned, well, since early 2000s, nothing has changed a lot in leadership and in our neighboring country, Russian Federation, whereas in Europe and transatlantic, yes, we have seen the changes. But what I wanted to ask is actually, whenever these cycles appear, the previous cycle, the main topic was populists. How do we counter populists, especially within the EU? And then just, you know, we focused everything on how to counter within the EU, the populists and et cetera. And we were ignorant to see actually that the populists are fueled from outside. And this is something that we're realizing right now with, for example, with the Biden administration. We see the new thing, that democracies need to fight autocracies. And my question to all the panelists is, what tools or skill set leaders in Europe, in the transatlantic community, have in order to actually really fight autocracies? Here I speak Russia, here I speak China. Do we have all those tools, and do we actually understand how we're going to approach these issues? Because, as I said, yeah, we can continue to fight populism, and it's still there, but we're all aware that the populists, they're giving the fuel through disinformation that mainly is driven from outside, from autocracies, that we try to find a dialogue. And main question, well, Biden is organizing the Democracy Summit at the end of the year. Will there be something, some outcome from the leadership, from the European leaders, and from the transatlantic colleagues to actually give an answers on how we tackle autocracies? Last but not least, the imminent threat that I see is actually the credibility and stability and authority of international organizations that through the autocracies that I mentioned have been undermined in so many ways. Just last one, OECD Human Rights Conference, just being banned because, you know, Russia decided, you know, we're not going to go with it. Is that something that we are allowing to happen? And do we have tools to stop it? Thank you.
Hamid, please. Yes.
Yes, thank you. Oh, yeah, it's Kalnich from Parliament. We talked about leadership changes in Europe, and James Scher brought up the leadership change in the U.S. When Biden replaced Trump, there was a great deal of hope that 4 years of dismal U.S.-EU relations would finally return to normal and start improving. And in a way they have, but there have been some bumps on the road, namely the reaction to Afghanistan, also the French reaction to the Australian sub. And my question is whether the European reaction is primarily for domestic audiences, because of local politics trying to stand up to the U.S. Is there something, or is this more deep-seated? Because it seems like in both these cases the criticism has died down. There's just been a EU trade, U.S. trade meeting that seems to be very successful. Are these just blips in the road, and are these politicians just playing to their local audiences? And is the U.S.-EU relationship back on track?
Thank you very much for your presentation. Within the context of what was said, sorry? Oh, sorry, Hamid Lajavardi. The Western leadership, as we all know, the global issue is becoming more and more complex. Issues that are being raised at certain circles is, are the democracy that we've been practicing so far sufficient to address complex global issues? Because in order to have the democracy that we have aspired to, needs an educated complexity of the world. Maybe that's no longer possible in the same manner. So the suggestion is that perhaps we need a more autocratic democracy, if such a thing can be used. And that is within the context of at least national. Russia, quite apparent that Russia is the junior partner of China from every angle that you can think of. My question is, imperial past and pride willing to accept that junior position, or will they find a way to balance that junior position with some leverage from the West? And that would mean that they would try to, in some ways, hedge their bets against total dependency on China as a junior partner. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's come back to the panelists, and then we come to the second round. Please.
Rita, let's start with you, autocratic democracy and some other issues, perhaps.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Very good questions, very broad questions as well. Democracies versus autocracies, well, the main difference between democracies and autocracies when it comes to their competition is that democracies are open and autocracies are closed. Therefore, democracies are more vulnerable for the actions, malicious actions of the autocracies. So the autocracies are using so-called sharp power to manipulate the political systems of democracies and to inflict the damage of the democracies. And we cannot do the same because we are democracies, so it's not our style, first of all. And second of all, they can always shut down the internet, close down the media outlets, close down the social media. Therefore, they are not vulnerable. So in this situation, it seems that democracies are very much vulnerable, and we cannot do anything about the autocracies. But it's not true. And in fact, democracies has a lot of strength within them. First of all, their societies. Of course, there are ups and downs, and the societies sometimes do vote for the politicians. But even in terms of pandemia, what I have been watching, there was a big unity within the societies to stand together against certain things, because we cherish the societies that we live in. We want to protect there. Whereas in autocracies, it's a vertical. It's the societies that live in fear. So that's a very important issue. What can we do? Resilience, internal resilience. So we are as strong as strong is our society. So the more we are resilient vis-a-vis these attempts to manipulate, the better we are able to fight their autocracies. So that's the first thing, ensure resilience vis-a-vis information attacks, cyber attacks, and in general, invest more in the society, in the unity of the society, that we would be facing less divisions in the society, because these divisions are exploited by the authoritarian countries, and this is a very important vulnerability. Unity of action of the democracies. And I think what we are seeing in this narrative of Biden of the community of democracies, so we're already stepping the first steps in order to unite the democracies. Australia, UK, US, AUKUS. Maybe Europeans were not so happy with this alliance, well, not Europeans, French were not so happy, but not because this alliance is being forged, but because they lost a very lucrative defense contract. So it's a different thing. Then, well, trying to look at the other democracies like Taiwan, which have been not very natural partner probably for this part of the world, but it's democracy. So there are some steps that I already see in terms of unifying of democracies, and that's very important because we cherish our way of life, the way how we are organizing our society. But the most important thing is to be able to push back when the autocracies are attacking. And of course, it's not that easy because democracies are all fluffy and nice, and we do not return the migrants from the border because we are facing lots of problems with the international institutions. But to a certain extent, we have to have these tools because we are becoming too vulnerable. Yeah, change of the leadership in the US, is it really worrying Europeans, or it's more of a stance? I think that Europeans understand that without the US they are doomed, they are small and they are not very important in the world, and every European country, even the biggest ones like Germany, is still a very small power when you look at the world. So I think that there is this understanding that, you know, US is extremely important, is a key country to cooperate, and I don't see that this transatlantic relation would be broken apart, maybe deteriorating and getting better, yes, but broken apart in the forthcoming future. And the US needs Europeans as well. Yeah.
You don't have to respond to all questions.
No, but I want to answer one particular thing about the China-Russia junior partner. I think that, to a certain extent, now we're talking about the situation where Russia has a choice. But let me look from the other perspective. If we're talking about the integration in the Chinese technological grid, like 5Gs, the programs, Chinese technologies, I think that to a certain extent it might be the point where Russia does not have a choice to choose another partner. Because what I'm seeing now, there is a lot of integration, again, going in the Western democracies in terms of the safe network, choosing, the safe grids, safe internet, while going away from the Chinese 5G projects. And there is not a such, I don't see this discussion happening in Russia. So if you are integrated into this Chinese net, at some point, maybe your hands might be entirely tied and you don't have to, and you don't have a choice to choose your partner. So
Okay, then.
that's it.
Thank you. So it means there will be chance also for Victoria to respond on this Chinese presence in the Russian politics and choices. Christo, please.
Well, I would like to pick the question of the populist threat to societies, because I think, yes, it is possible to fuel the populist movement inside a society, but the reasons for populist movements or right-wing movements have been there before. It roots often in a social problems inside a society, social differences. So what we have to discuss also to become more resilient towards a populist threat means to think how we can make our societies more inclusive, so that it is more difficult to go in between and to take certain groups against other groups, and to have an understanding that the elites of a society are not the enemy of the society, which is the understanding in most of the populist movement. We look to Germany and the alternative, so-called Alternative for Germany, far right-wing party. One of their support comes from people that think the elites do the wrong things, they are against them, they don't understand them. So it is the task for the coming years in democratic societies to have a better communication inside society and between elites, political elites, but also other elites and the normal population, and to work for the social balance and for a more inclusive society. And just to pick one more of the topics, the question whether we might need a more autocratic democracy to tackle global problems. I don't think so, because a population that elects a government doesn't need to understand all the complexity, but it needs to understand some strategic lines, and it is possible to communicate that. What does it mean for your freedom? What does it mean a certain development for the prosperity of a society? And I have seen that in our discussion in Germany. I think I have mentioned it. We didn't have really a good public discussion about foreign policy. What is the German interest in foreign policy? What are the different possible strategies? So far we have a very, very narrow space only to operate in foreign policy in Germany. So what we need to do is to discuss more openly also controversial points of view, so that a society gets used to a discussion about aims of a society and the space of movement of politics, and understand the main lines, what is important for the development of the country. And then I think democracies have much more potential to deal with those global challenges, because they are much more creative than autocracies.
So thank you for being a strong advocate on democratic efficiency as well. I'm afraid already to look at James, who is watching, and his watch again. Please, James, the floor is yours.
I will confine myself to some staccato replies, which will therefore be unsatisfying. Where support for populists comes from outside and violates national law, if it can be documented, it needs to be documented and publicized by governments. There needs to be public naming and shaming and release of information that we have, apart from that which would be damaging to security and security interests. Number two, if international organizations want to be taken seriously, they need to take themselves seriously. One organization that does clearly is the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of the Use of Conventional Weapons. Does the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe take itself seriously? Well, I will leave that as a rhetorical question dangling in the air. The issue of transatlantic relations, of course, it's not an adversarial set of relations, but like the West's relationship with Russia, there are deep roots to some of these differences. And it's very naive to think that because a new administration comes to office, that this is going to disappear. But let's be even-handed about this, please. When Biden came to office, he was confronted with a fait accompli in the form of the EU-China agreement. No consultation whatsoever. Let's not forget also that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which caused as much division inside Europe as it did in transatlantic terms, that was enabled in the end because the Biden administration issued an executive order suspending congressional sanctions. So let's be somewhat even-handed about this. Excellent question about educated citizen. It is a major deficit. We are all living with the paradox that the more information there is, the less informed we are, the more confused. Social media and information as such is not a synonym for or a substitute for education. And governments today, compared to 50 years ago, spend less time directly addressing the citizen and explaining what our interests are, what we are doing, and why. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
James, excellent, thank you. Victoria, but if I may be a little bit devil's advocate and play geopolitical games in our intellectual exchange, what we can hear here, namely, it's that we recognize that within democracies there are inherent vulnerabilities, that we face open societies, populists, etc., different voices. So actually, leadership which is changing and challenged, it's by definition in democracy. Sooner or later it will be changed, and perhaps it's permanently challenged by the developments within a societies. I would still, because when you were touching on leadership challenges, you discussed mostly global ones, but I still would be leading back to the Russian domestic political leadership. Is it in any way changing or challenged? And not only by Chinese.
Okay, allow me, I will probably keep a question for their kind of, as their, for the last portion, but I will start with what was asked by the audience first. So what I should say is that Europe, United States, Japan, also called Western world, they are advanced economies that had high-tech developments and globalization. They were real promoters of globalization and promotion of high-tech, promotion of internet. And those were the countries who also insisted, like 30, 40 years ago, on spread of information to other countries. Now you found yourself in a more dangerous environment because with the help of those technologies that's been in fact spread to all parts of the world, most of course we still have this digital inequality, we still have some countries and regions where there is much less access to such means, but at the same time we still have incomparably much greater amount of people who could access internet, who could access information. In Russia, this is practically everywhere. So lots of people, most people have access to internet. Not everybody, I mean, apart from probably some retired people, majority, absolute majority of Russians, they go into internet. And they watch different and read different news. Not Российская газета, not Аргументы и факты, they would be going, and in addition to Kommersant or Ведомости, they would be also reading Washington Post, New York Times, The Guardian, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This Financial Times. This is the fact of life. So the point is that nowadays, when you're talking about the manipulations or the lack of choice or those people not able to be choosing, this is quite strange because those people who have access to full information, in fact, unlike the decisions that were taken by, let's say, Facebook and WhatsApp. And as you remember, as a consequence, including in Western countries, Telegram got a huge boost because lots of people moved away from there to a more neutral means of social networks. That's one thing. Another thing about democracy and social media. There is one country that all of you would definitely call a democracy. It is also by all means invited by President Biden to the Summit of Democracies. I can tell you a couple of years ago, I mean, I would not be telling exact dates, but the government of this country had a direct contract signed with Facebook to participate, for it to participate in elections and to promote information among its citizens. Would you call it a manipulation? Well, you would definitely do it if it were, for example, some Russian outlet. Little 30 seconds of educational activities. OSCE is something where we have consensus. It's not just Russia. It could be Romania. It could be Poland. It could be any small country that can have that can say, I don't want this document or this meeting to happen. And we had such instances several times, both during the Cold War and after the Cold War. So this is the mode of this particular institution, how it works. Those who dislike it should not be or do not have to work within this organization. They can be using other means of cooperation, other means of international institutions. So if you don't like this institution, the rules that were worked out by consensus with all the participants, then of course you work within different mechanisms. When we talk about internal, before answering China, I will go back to Andres. So when we are being talked about unchanging, unchallenged leadership, interestingly, with all the difficulties there, United Russia is having, and we had, in fact, rise of this New People Party, especially among young people. It is true that the president himself remains popular. And this brings me to the start of my answer, which is those are people who access internet, access information. So it is quite strange to hear that the choice of a people for their country is seen as undemocratic because the other citizens of other countries do not like the leader that they've chosen. So if you don't like the leader, you would see it as undemocratic. So if you don't like Biden, would you say that it was a non-democratic elections? So I would put it to absurd, but this is exactly what you guys were saying. In fact, because with their administrative resources used when we're talking about elections, United Russia lost a lot and it had lots of problems. That's why we had popular figures in the country like Shoigu or Lavrov being in the top 5 of the party list. But the president who's being elected in fact, does remain as a kind of most popular figure among its citizens, at least its majority. I do hope myself that we will, we think we should be striving to have people choose for whom they see fit best, but definitely there should be people revolving around power that first, on the one hand, professional, on the other hand, patriotic, on the third hand, they do not get distracted from people's needs. This is vital. With it, what happens in 2024, I cannot tell you at the moment, and I think this is not the point of this particular conference. So probably we could go and see what happens with the evolution of their political, international internal system, with economic developments, etc., etc. But this still remains to be seen. With Russia being Chinese junior partner, definitely this is the discourse that we hear all the time from our Western partners. Russia would never be recognizing this. Russia would not be allowing for it to be used as a kind of opponent or balancer against China, because first of all, we do learn lessons from history. It is, but Russia would be, and it is doing now, we are going together where we see us being together and comfortable together. Certainly they might be, as was said by one of the speakers, there might be a situation where we don't have choice, but in fact we still remain quite a good capacity in terms of intellectual capacity for technologies. So there is something we can give back in order to get either from China or from less politically prone countries. For example, if you look at Asia, even close US allies are not going very hand in hand with their policies and sanctions. And it is possible to develop technological cooperation with those parts as well. Also, we have probably not best advanced technological powers, but still quite strong ones like India, both within BRICS and in bilateral terms. So there is quite a good set of cooperation. And definitely,
Victoria,
I'm finishing, and we would not be doing something which is against our rights. So just an example. China is not saying anything about Crimea. We're not saying anything and remaining neutral on South China Sea. That just a little example. And I think we will continue in the same mode. Thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but I still would ask a last question just to conclude and somehow to connect those two important parts, what we discussed today, the political leadership changing, challenged, and West-Russia relations. If we take into account that still in democracies, in autocracies, there are some challenges, some vulnerabilities to the political leadership in one way or in another. And we can especially speak about some crises, as we admitted, on the Western side as well. So those challenged political leaderships, these ingrained crises within our political systems we are dealing with, where it will lead to. The weaknesses will lead actually to strengthening relationships. There is some positive light in the tunnel, or vice versa. What we can expect that actually from positions of the weakness, if the leaderships are challenged and being changed, then actually it might also aggravate the Western-Russian relations. Vika, let's start with you. 10 seconds. Half a minute maximum.
Very important point. Go beyond stereotypes for any leadership would be important, and probably another one. We might have to run into more serious crisis where both parties would see that if they go beyond it, it would be the end for both. So this will push them towards negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you. James? Optimist or pessimist?
in Russia's case, and I do not have time to even begin a defense of this outrageous statement that I strongly believe, the most dangerous moment will come if and when Russia loses a foreign war. What is happening inside Russia will lead to a bumpy decline over a long period of time. In the United States, many used to lament the fact that for most people were indifferent about the outcome of elections. Now the situation is radically changed, and there is a risk that the fundamental stability of the United States will be threatened if one side views the victory of the other as something completely intolerable. And that, I'm afraid, is on the cards, and that will be a real crisis.
Thank you, James. Christoph?
Well, I think as we have talked about the stability of democracies, I think in the long run, the democracies are able to be more stable than autocratic systems, because they have every time to prove to their citizens that they work for them. And as we've seen in history, some systems that seem to be stable under autocratic rule or dictatorship, they are inside more unstable than we might think. So that's why I think that for the further development, if we are careful with democracy, if we are careful with working for inclusive society, if we explain politics in a better way, we will see a good stability of democracies, and we will be able also to tackle global problems with that.
Okay, more optimistic note. Margarita, and you?
It's very difficult to be short on that, but I'll try my best.
Pessimist or optimist?
Well, different. There are different angles. Well, I'm an academic, so it's not that easy to be one-sided. When there was this discussion about autocratic and democratic crisis management, what is better in the face of COVID, I was asking my students the only question. In this pandemic, where would you like to live, in China or in Europe? And the answer was very, like 100% in Europe. So I think that society realizes the benefits of democracy, and that's the strength of the democracy. But sometimes democracies turn into autocracies, and sometimes it happens very incrementally, but it happens. So we have to be aware of that and be very, very bold about the democratic values and what does it mean, and try to preserve them.
But what it means for West-Russia relations?
So for the West-Russia relations, it could mean a lot of things. I mean, it could mean can we spread the virus of democracy onto Russia, or could Russia spread the virus of autocracy on us? So if we don't preserve our democracy, well, there is a chance that we can lose it. Although I think that everyone realizes that the democracy has a lot of benefits. But my last point, in terms of all these challenges that we will be facing in the forthcoming years, I think that we have to stop talking about the democracy versus autocracy. We have to talk about that, but not only that. Democracy also has its flaws. And the state-oriented, state-centric world is not capable of solving major problems that we are facing today, like climate change, migration. So multi-level governance, including the private and NGOs, should at some point considered more by the states, and the states should be more inclusive in terms of how they solve the international crisis and invite these new other actors to the table and create the common solutions, because only on the state level you cannot solve those issues, and then the democracies would be attacked.
Okay, thank you so much. And if I can conclude a bit myself using this pessimist-optimist analogy and applying to the Western-Russian relations, that at least from the Central and East European perspective, the pessimist says, look, I mean, things have hit rock bottom. Optimist would say they could certainly get worse. Yes. So let's hope for the best, but still be ready that also some things might become even more complicated before they become better and we find some also convergences on fundamental level. Thank you so much, Toba. I invite also to join a round of applause for this in-person discussion. Thank you. Thank you once more to the speakers. Thank you, Victoria. And next time, certainly, you'll be able also come to Latvia, and geopolitics will not prohibit it. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.